This is a story that can change how you see pain and injustice. It shows what happens when a human being is pushed past every limit and still does not break. If you carry anger, fear, or old wounds inside, ignoring this story means choosing to stay in that prison. If you ever felt that life stole something from you, this man can show you what you still have left. Because Louis Zamperini went from Olympic stadiums to Japanese prison camps and still found the strength to forgive the people who tried to destroy him. Louis did not grow up as a saint or a quiet hero. He was a wild child in a small American town in California. His parents were Italian immigrants who worked hard, spoke with an accent, and tried to give their sons a better life. Louis was the boy who got into fights, stole things, and ran away from trouble. He smoked, drank, and broke rules before most kids even knew those rules existed. Teachers called him a lost cause. Neighbors said he would end up in prison. His own family was afraid that the world would crush him before he turned 20. Then something unexpected happened. Louis discovered that his legs could save him. To escape from angry policemen and neighbors, he started to run. First, it was just a way to get away. Then a coach noticed how fast this troublemaker was. On the track, he finally heard different words. Not criminal, not problem, fast, gifted, champion. Running became his way out of the life everyone predicted for him. Day after day, he trained. He ran until his lungs burned and his vision went dark at the edges. He stopped stealing and started chasing records. The same stubbornness that had made him a nightmare for adults now made him unstoppable on the track. He broke school records. He became a local star, then a national one. In 1936, he joined the American Olympic team and sailed to Berlin. He was no longer the kid who ran from policemen. He was the young man in a clean uniform, marching into a stadium of 100,000 faces. In Berlin, he did not win a medal, but he did something that a reporter never forgot. In the final lap of his race, he ran so fast that the crowd stood up. He sprinted with everything he had. It was like he tried to outrun his whole past in one single lap. He finished with a closing speed that shocked the world. Even Adolf Hitler asked to see the young runner who had done that last lap. For a few brief years, Louis Zamperini was a symbol of hope, talent, and the bright future of a country that still believed the worst was behind it. Then the world changed. War swallowed the stadium lights and replaced them with searchlights and burning skies. When the United States entered the Second World War, Louis did not stay on the track. He joined the Army Air Forces and became a bombardier on a B-24 bomber in the Pacific. The boy who once ran on smooth cinder tracks now worked inside a heavy metal machine over the ocean, surrounded by noise, fear, and flak. Flying in the Pacific was not like stories in newspapers. The planes were old, heavy, and hard to control. Engines failed. Guns jammed. Maps were not always correct. Weather turned without warning. Every mission carried the same quiet question in the back of the crew mind. Will we come back? On May 27, 1943, Louis and his crew were sent on a rescue mission over the endless blue of the Pacific. Their plane, called the Green Hornet, was already known as unreliable. It had a history of mechanical problems. But orders were orders. They took off to look for other lost airmen. High above the water, the engines began to fail. Metal screamed. The heavy bomber shook apart. The ocean rushed up toward them. In a few seconds, the world of noise turned into cold, crushing silence. The plane hit the water and broke open like a toy in the hands of a giant. Many crew members died instantly. The few who survived found themselves in the middle of an empty ocean with only small rubber rafts and the clothes on their backs. Louis was pulled into one of the rafts along with two other men. The sun burned their skin during the day. The cold bit their bones at night. They faced hunger, thirst, and the slow terror of drifting without land in sight. Sharks circled under them like shadows that wanted to become real. Storms smashed their fragile rafts. When it rained, they lifted their faces and caught drops of water with shaking tongues. Day after day, they drifted. They ate raw fish. They caught birds with bare hands. They prayed simple broken prayers. Their bodies shrank. Their minds played tricks. The line between hope and madness became very thin. On one day, a Japanese plane appeared in the sky. For a moment, the men felt hope. Maybe someone was looking for them. But the plane opened fire on the tiny rafts. Bullets tore through rubber and water while Louis and the others threw themselves into the sea, pushing the raft down with one hand to keep it from exploding and fighting sharks with the other. They survived the attack, climbed back onto the riddled raft, and drifted on. By the time they finally saw land, they had spent 47 days at sea. They had lost so much weight that they looked like ghosts wearing loose skin. But the island they reached was not a friendly shore. It was controlled by the Japanese military. Instead of food and safety, they found guns and uniforms. They were taken as prisoners of war. In that moment, the nightmare changed shape, but did not end. In some ways, it became worse. On the ocean, they had faced hunger and nature. In the camps, they faced cruelty, humiliation, and deliberate attempts to break their spirit. Louis was moved from place to place through several prison camps. He was beaten. He was forced to work while sick and exhausted. He was used for propaganda. His captors knew he had been an Olympic runner. To them, he was a useful symbol. To some guards, he was also a target. One guard in particular became the face of evil in Louis' life. A Japanese corporal with the nickname the Bird. He was young, elegant, and educated, but inside he was full of rage and twisted pride. He chose Louis as his personal victim. He beat him with fists and sticks. He humiliated him in front of other prisoners. He made him do pointless labor just to see him suffer. He tried to break the one thing Louis still had, his sense of self. In one camp, the Bird ordered every prisoner to line up and punch Louis in the face one by one. If they refused, they would be punished. The men stood in line and hit their friend while crying or whispering apologies under their breath. Louis stood and took the blows because he did not want the others to suffer. By the end, his face was swollen and bloody, but the guards still did not feel satisfied. The war dragged on. Many prisoners died from disease, beatings, and starvation. Louis' body weakened, but his stubborn spirit refused to let go. He made small decisions to live. He stole extra food when he could. He shared jokes. He listened for news. He repeated to himself that he would not die there. He imagined running again. He imagined going home. He imagined eating his mother pasta and sleeping in a clean bed. At last, in 1945, the war ended. The atomic bombs fell. Japan surrendered. The prison camp gates opened not with ceremony, but with confusion and fear. Guards ran away to avoid punishment. Prisoners looked at each other, not sure if freedom was real or another trick. Louis and the others were rescued. They were weighed. They were given real food and clean clothes. They were put on ships and planes and sent back across the ocean. News of his survival reached his family before he did. For years, they had believed he was dead. His name had been written on lists. His picture had been placed with other fallen sons. When his mother learned he was alive, she fell to her knees and wept. When Louis finally stepped off the train in America, he tried to walk with the same light stride he had used as an athlete. But inside, he was not the same young man who had once run that famous last lap in Berlin. On the surface, his life looked like a happy ending. He married a beautiful woman named Cynthia. He became a small celebrity. The newspapers loved the story of the Olympian who had survived a plane crash, 47 days at sea, in Japanese prison camps. He was invited to give speeches. People shook his hand and called him a hero. But when the lights went off and the crowds went home, Louis was alone with his memories. At night, he woke up drenched in sweat, his heart racing, his hands ready to fight. In dreams, he was back in the camp. He felt the bird hands on him. He heard the orders. He smelled the rot and the blood. Sometimes he woke up choking his own wife because in the dream she had turned into his tormentor and he was fighting for his life. He could not explain it. He only knew that sleep had become a battlefield. During the day, he tried to act strong. He smiled. He said he was fine. Inside, he felt like the war never ended. He drank to silence the noise in his head. At first, it was a drink with friends to calm down, then another one to fall asleep. Then he needed alcohol to get through the day. The man who had survived sharks and beatings slowly became a prisoner of a bottle. His anger grew like a second skeleton inside him. He thought about the bird with a burning focus. He imagined flying back to Japan, hunting him down, and killing him with his own hands. The idea of revenge became a kind of comfort. If he could punish the man who had hurt him, maybe the nightmares would stop. So he believed. But revenge did not give him sleep. It gave him more hatred. It pulled him away from the people who loved him. His wife watched the man she loved disappear under layers of noise, rage, and alcohol. Their home became a place of arguments and broken promises. At one point, she decided to leave him and take their small daughter with her. She could not live with a husband who was always drunk, always angry, and never really present. This was the second war of Louis Zamperini life. On paper, the war in the Pacific had ended. In his mind, it was still moving, still shooting, still beating him in the dark. This is one of the most painful truths about trauma. The body returns. The mind can stay behind on the battlefield for years. Then something small happened that would change everything. His wife did not leave immediately. Someone invited her to a Christian revival meeting in a big tent in Los Angeles. The speaker was a young preacher named Billy Graham. He talked about sin, guilt, anger, and the possibility of a new life through faith in Christ. Cynthia listened. She saw her husband in every word about bitterness and chains. She made a decision. She went home and told Louis that she had found hope and that she wanted him to go with her to the meetings. At first, he refused. He did not want to listen to a preacher talk about forgiveness. He felt that nobody who had not been in a prison camp had the right to tell him how to feel. But his wife did not give up. She told him that she no longer wanted to divorce him. She wanted to try again, but she needed him to come at least once. Finally, he agreed. He sat in the big tent with his arms crossed, ready to mock and resist everything he heard. As Billy Graham spoke, Louis felt anger rise inside him. Words about sin did not touch him. Words about love sounded soft and naive to a man who had seen men beaten to death. But then Graham talked about prisoners of anger and people who could not sleep because of the past. He spoke about Christ's suffering and forgiving those who hurt him. He said that God could reach even into the darkest memories and bring peace if a person would surrender. Louis remembered a moment on the raft, far out on the Pacific. In a storm, he had shouted a desperate promise to God. "If you save me from this, I will serve you." At the time, it was only a survival instinct, a thin thread of hope. He had forgotten that promise under the weight of war and alcohol. Sitting in the tent, he felt that memory return with sharp clarity. He realized that he had lived for years as if he never said those words. In that moment, something inside him finally broke. Not in the way his enemies had tried to break him in the camp. This was different. He stood up, walked to the front, and quietly gave his life to the faith he had resisted. He went home and poured out all his alcohol. He never drank again. It was not a slow change in that one area. That part ended that day. More important, the nightmares began to lose their power. He still remembered the camps, the hunger, and the bird. But the images no longer ruled him in the same way. He said that the moment he surrendered his rage, the night terrors that had haunted him for years finally stopped. For him, this was not an idea on paper, but a real change that he felt in his body and mind. His faith did not erase his past. It changed his relationship to it. He began to see his survival as a responsibility, not just a miracle. If he had lived through the plane crash, the ocean, and the camps, then maybe he was meant to do something more than drink and rage. He started speaking publicly about his experience, but now with a different tone. Instead of feeding hatred, he spoke about resilience, hope, and the possibility of forgiveness. Then he made a decision that many people still find almost impossible to understand. He decided to forgive his captors, not in a vague emotional way. He wanted to look them in the eyes and say it. He joined a group that traveled to Japan to visit former prison guards and soldiers. The men who had once stood over him with weapons now stood in front of him as older men, some of them broken and ashamed. He shook their hands. He told them that he forgave them. Some cried, some bowed. The chains that had tied him to those camps grew weaker with each step. There was one man he especially wanted to see, the bird. By then, the bird was a wanted war criminal who had escaped and lived in hiding. They never met face to face. Louis still decided to forgive him in his heart. He even wrote him a letter years later, saying that he no longer hated him, that he wished him well, and that he hoped he would find peace. Imagine that. A man who had every reason to hate, choosing instead to let go. Forgiveness did not mean that what happened was small. It did not clean the camps or erase the scars on his body. It did not mean the guards were innocent. Forgiveness for Louis meant that he would no longer let those men decide who he was and how he felt every day. He chose to stop living as a victim and started living as a survivor with a purpose. He spent the rest of his life sharing that message. He worked with troubled youth. He created a camp for boys who were on the edge of crime and broken lives. He knew that many of them were like his younger self, angry and lost. He told them that they were not defined by their worst actions or worst days. He told them that discipline, faith, and forgiveness were not weakness but strength. His story became famous again decades later through a best-selling book and a film. People who had never heard of the 1936 Olympics or the Pacific or suddenly saw the face of this old man who once had been a wild boy and a prisoner. In interviews, he sat with a peaceful look, talking in a calm voice about events that would destroy most people from the inside. He did not hide the pain. He described it clearly, but he added one more layer. He always came back to forgiveness and the freedom it gave him. Think about the arc of this one life. A boy that teachers saw as hopeless. A runner who became a national hero. A soldier who fell from the sky into the sea. A survivor who drifted for 47 days with sharks beneath him and death all around. A prisoner beaten and humiliated by a man who seemed to enjoy cruelty. A veteran who came home with invisible wounds and tried to drown them in alcohol. A husband who almost lost his family. A man who then found faith, kept his promise from a raft, and chose to forgive the people he once wanted to kill. This is why his story matters for you today. You do not need to have survived a war to feel what he felt. Maybe your battlefield was a childhood home full of shouting. Maybe it was a broken marriage, a betrayal from a friend, a sickness, or a loss that cut your soul open. Maybe you have your own version of the bird, a person whose face still appears in your mind when you wake up at night. Your anger might feel like protection. Your bitterness might feel like justice. But step by step, it can turn into a prison without walls. Louis Zamperini life shows that forgiveness is not about saying that evil was not evil. It is about deciding that evil will not rule the rest of your life. His story shows that courage is not only in running fast or standing up under beatings. Sometimes the greatest courage is to open your hand and let go of the stone you have been holding for years. You do not have to share his faith to understand the power of his choice. You only have to ask yourself how long you want your past to control your future. When you think of Louis, do not stop at the image of a young runner in an Olympic stadium or a starving prisoner in a camp. Remember the older man who could sit across from former enemies and speak without hatred. Remember the husband who kept his family and broke the chain of violence inside himself. Remember the speaker who spent his time lifting up broken kids instead of chasing revenge. He was not perfect. He still had struggles. But he lived the second half of his life in a way that many people never dare to try. If this story touches you, let it do more than move your emotions for a few minutes. Let it become a mirror. Ask yourself what part of your life still feels like a prison camp, even though the war is long over. Ask yourself what memory still beats you when you try to sleep. Ask yourself what name still makes your hands tighten and your heart grow hard. You may not be ready to forgive today. That is all right. Louis also walked a long road through anger and self-destruction before he reached that point. But his journey stands as a living proof that change is possible even after the worst storms. Pain does not have to be the final word. The story of Louis Zamperini is not only about war and survival. It is about what a human soul can become when it refuses to let evil define its last chapter.